manages his music catalog, controls his image rights, and, as we just covered, actively enforces the legal boundaries around what stories can and can't be told about him on screen. That cooperation almost certainly explains the extraordinary access this film clearly had throughout production. The real family members appearing on set, the costume accuracy signed off on by people who actually knew Michael personally, the sheer depth of archival material made available to the actors during preparation. But when cooperation with an estate is never a neutral, purely artistic arrangement, an estate has a legacy to protect, and very often a direct financial interest riding on exactly how that legacy gets remembered by the public. Every creative choice we've walked through so far, what gets shown in full light, what gets softened around the edges, what gets left quietly in shadow like that unnamed thriller director, sits downstream of that single relationship. This is the detail most casual viewers walk right past without noticing, because the film is structured so carefully that the controversy barely registers as controversy at all inside the theater. Michael Jackson faced multiple public allegations of child sexual abuse during his career and in the years following his death. He was tried on criminal charges in 2003 and found not guilty by a jury, and he consistently denied all such allegations throughout his life, right up until his death in 2009. Michael acknowledges almost none of this directly within its 2-hour runtime, which the filmmakers have suggested was always the intended structure, focusing this first installment purely on Michael's rise to fame and reserving the more difficult, more painful chapters, if they ever get made at all, for a planned second film covering the rest of his life and career. Whether that structural choice is a genuinely fair way to tell a complete story in 2 carefully planned parts, or a convenient way to release a celebratory film first, while indefinitely deferring the hardest questions to some hypothetical sequel, is exactly the debate that's followed this project from the moment it was first announced. The film hands you spectacle right now. It asks you to wait, possibly forever, for reckoning. And that timing matters more than it might seem at first glance. A film that ends before the controversy ever really begins gets to send audiences home on a high note, cheering, humming Billie Jean, remembering exactly why they fell in love with Michael's music in the first place. A film that had included even a condensed version of the allegations would have sent those same audiences home with a completely different feeling in their chest. One version fills seats and builds goodwill for a sequel. The other one risks the box office. It's worth asking which consideration actually won out here, and whether we're saving it for part 2. Is a storytelling strategy or a marketing one wearing a storytelling strategy's clothes? 1. The nephew. Playing him isn't just an actor, he's a witness. And that brings us to the biggest hidden detail of all, the one sitting quietly in plain sight in absolutely every single frame of this movie. Jaafar Jackson isn't a trained biopic actor who studied hundreds of hours of tape and carefully learned a role from the outside in. He's Michael's actual nephew, Jermaine's son, someone who grew up physically inside this family, who carries his own real childhood memories of the man everyone else in the world only ever knew from magazine covers and courtroom transcripts. That single fact changes what this entire film actually is. Underneath everything else, every performance Jaafar recreates on screen isn't just choreography copied carefully from archival footage. It's filtered through decades of lived, personal, deeply felt history with the exact person he's portraying. When the family stood behind this project publicly, when the estate agreed to cooperate closely with production, when the costume designer quietly built her own father into the recreated Motown 25 crowd, all of it was ultimately in service of one central unspoken idea, that the people closest to Michael Jackson wanted to be the ones who got to tell this version of his story first, on their own terms, before anyone else could tell it for them. Whether that makes Michael more honest or simply more protective might be the only question on this entire list that actually matters. And it's a question this film, quite deliberately, leaves sitting there for you to answer on your own long after the credits finish rolling. Think back to the 20 details we just walked through, and notice how many of them point in the exact same direction. The rougher, unpolished moonwalk chosen for authenticity, a real family member sitting in the recreated crowd, a wardrobe department measuring success by whether the Jacksons themselves approved, a director kept just out of frame so the film wouldn't have to reckon with what he represents, a settlement that legally rewrote an entire act, an estate with both creative access and financial stake. None of these are separate stories. They're all the same story, told 20 different ways. A family finally in control of the camera, deciding exactly how much of the truth an audience gets to see, and exactly when. 20 details. Some of them small, quiet tributes, hidden for the fans who'd actually know to look for them. A few of them decisions that shape the entire shadow this film casts around the parts of Michael's life it very deliberately chooses not to show you. The moonwalk gets all the applause, but it's the details standing just outside the spotlight that tell you what kind of film this really is. If you want to see more breakdowns like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. It is also, for a specific slice of the internet, deeply unsettling in a way nobody quite expected, because the movements were too fluid, the performance too natural, and almost immediately, comment sections filled with a single recurring joke that slowly stopped sounding like a joke to some people. What if it isn't a hologram at all? What if this is how he comes back? Obviously, it was a hologram. The production company behind it has documented publicly available records of exactly how it was built. But the emotional effect of watching a dead performer move, that convincingly live on a stage in front of a screaming crowd. It did something to the collective psyche that no amount of technical explanation could fully undo. Grief plus uncanny technology is a combustible mix. And in 2014, that mix went off in front of a global television audience. If a family is united in grief, conspiracy theories struggle to find oxygen. If a family keeps sending mixed signals for over a decade, the theories practically write themselves. Over the years, members of the Jackson family have said things, publicly, on record, that sound almost designed to fuel doubt, even when that was never the intention. LaToya Jackson, in interviews years after the death, made comments questioning aspects of the circumstances surrounding her brother's passing, before later walking parts of it back. Jermaine Jackson has spoken, at different points, about believing the full truth of what happened that day has never fully come out. And decades earlier, long before 2009, Michael Jackson himself had already given the public a real, well-documented precedent for exactly this kind of doubt. Because in 2005, during his acquittal on other charges, he quietly relocated to Bahrain under an arrangement involving a different public identity, living out of the spotlight for a stretch of time before eventually returning. That's not a rumor, that's documented history. Michael Jackson had, once before, disappeared from public life and reemerged under different circumstances. So when family members hint, even vaguely, that something doesn't add up, the audience doesn't hear vague grief. They hear confirmation of a pattern they already believed was possible. In his final weeks, cameras were rolling almost constantly, capturing rehearsal footage for This Is It. Hundreds of hours of it. Much of that footage would later be cut into the documentary, but far more of it exists in the raw, unedited archive than the public has ever seen in full. Fans who studied their released footage frame by frame started noticing what they describe as inconsistencies, a slightly different gait in some clips, subtle shifts in vocal tone between songs recorded on the same reported day, moments where lighting or wardrobe details seemed to contradict the timeline production staff gave. Film editors and forensic video analysts who've reviewed similar claims generally point to a much simpler explanation. Rehearsal footage shot across weeks under inconsistent lighting with a performer who was visibly exhausted and inconsistent night to night is going to look inconsistent. That's what real, unpolished production footage looks like. But inconsistent because reality is messy is a much less satisfying answer than inconsistent because something was being hidden. And in the attention economy of true crime YouTube, the less satisfying answer rarely wins the algorithm. Here's a detail most casual fans never learn, because it doesn't fit neatly into a 2-minute news segment. After the public memorial, Michael Jackson's body wasn't actually buried right away. For nearly 2 months, it sat in a vault at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, while the family reportedly debated where his final resting place should be, and while a custom mausoleum was prepared to hold him. 2 months, no headstone, no public burial, no confirmation ceremony that most fans could point to and say, that's the moment it became real. Cemetery officials have explained this kind of delay is not unusual for high-profile burials, where security concerns and construction timelines often push interment back by weeks or months. Elvis Presley's own burial was delayed and even relocated once for almost identical reasons: crowd control and permanent security planning. But explain that to a fan base already primed by an unopened coffin and a body they never saw. To them, a 2-month gap between he died and he was actually placed in the ground isn't bureaucracy. It's a window wide enough, in their minds, for anything to have happened. Every conspiracy eventually finds its numerologist, and Michael Jackson's death is no exception. He died on June 25th, 625. Fans point out that 625 appears, depending on how you squint, in various numeric patterns tied to his career. Album release dates, chart positions, even the exact runtime of certain music videos, if you're willing to round generously enough. His stage name initials, MJ, get mapped onto everything from flight numbers referenced in unrelated news stories to license plates spotted in random paparazzi photos of his children years later. None of this holds up to even basic scrutiny. Human brains are pattern-matching machines, and given a large enough pool of numbers connected to a famous person's life, you will always be able to find coincidences if you go looking hard enough. This is the exact same phenomenon that fuels Tupac numerology theories, JFK numerology theories, and virtually every major conspiracy built around a beloved public figure's death. But numerology isn't really about math. It's about pattern as reassurance. If the universe left a code, then the death wasn't random, wasn't senseless, wasn't just a preventable tragedy caused by greed and negligence. It was part of something bigger. For some fans, that idea is easier to sit with than the alternative. Perhaps the cruelest layer of this entire story is what it did to the 3 children Michael Jackson left behind. Paris Jackson, his daughter, has spoken publicly more than once about growing up online in a world where strangers genuinely believed her father was still alive somewhere and that she was in on the secret. In interviews years after his death, she's described the emotional toll of having to repeatedly, publicly confirm, as a teenager, to an audience she never asked for, that yes, her father is dead, and no, there is no hidden truth she's protecting. Prince Jackson has, at points, made similar public statements, describing the strangeness of watching people online debate the reality of his own father's death as if it were an open case rather than a settled, documented, deeply personal loss his family has had to live inside every single day since. For most conspiracy theories, the subject is a stranger, an abstraction, a face on a screen. This one has living children who had to grow up answering strangers' doubts about whether their father's body was really in that golden coffin. That's a detail worth sitting with before going any further down the rabbit hole. Step back for a second, because there's a pattern underneath every single fact so far, and it's worth naming directly. None of these 13 individual pieces of evidence, on their own, would convince a courtroom of anything. A blur no film experience really carry the weight of playing the most scrutinized entertainer who ever lived? Could anyone? He did more than pull it off. Within the first 10 minutes, the skepticism in most theaters had already started to melt. But here's the thing. Almost nobody talks about once the lights come back up. The performance itself was never the deepest layer of this film. Underneath the moonwalks and the sequined gloves, director Antoine Fuqua and his team buried dozens of details that only reveal themselves on a second, third, or 10th watch. Some are quiet tributes tucked into corners of the frame for the people who'd know to look. Some are historical corrections hiding in plain sight, small enough that a casual viewer would never register them. And a few of them are choices so deliberate, so loaded with what they refuse to say, that once you notice them, you can't unsee them. So today we're going frame by frame, 20 details. Some of them will make you appreciate this movie even more than you already do. A few of them are going to change the way you understand what this film was actually trying to say, and just as importantly, what it was trying very carefully not to say. And here's the part that makes this whole exercise worth doing. This isn't a rushed cash grab biopic slapped together to cash in on a trend. This is a film that took years to get to screen, that pulled in actual Jackson family members as advisors, and in one case, literally put them in the crowd. Every Cho ice on this list was made by someone. Nothing here is careless, which means every omission is just as deliberate as every detail they chose to include. Let's start with the one hiding inside the most famous scene in the entire movie. To most of the audience, the Motown 25 sequence is just the moment. Michael steps out in the black sequined jacket, the crowd loses its mind, and he glides backward across that stage for the first time in front of the world. It's the movie's emotional peak, the scene the trailer was built around, and on the surface it looks like exactly what you've already seen in 1,000 YouTube clips and documentary retrospectives. But look closer, frame by frame, and something's different. Jaafar doesn't perform the smooth, effortless version of the moonwalk that Michael would later polish to razor-sharp perfection on the History Tour a decade later. He performs the rougher one, the infant version, slightly stiffer, slightly less controlled, exactly as raw and unfinished as it actually was in 1983, before Michael had spent the next 10 years refining it into the impossible-looking illusion the whole world now associates with him. That's not an accident, and it's not a limitation of Jaafar's dancing either. It's historical accuracy dressed up as spontaneity, and it's the kind of choice only someone who studied hundreds of hours of footage would even think to make. The film wanted you to feel the same shock the 1983 audience felt in that room, watching something nobody had ever seen before, performed by someone who hadn't perfected it yet either, who was still finding the edges of what his own body could do live on stage. It's a small choice buried in 3 seconds of screen time. But it's the difference between a tribute act and something closer to a time machine. Here's where it gets personal and where the line between movie set and family reunion starts to blur. During that same Motown 25 performance, watch the front row of the audience closely. There's a moment where a man rises out of his seat, visibly stunned, right as Michael completes the moonwalk for the first time. On a casual watch, that reads as exactly what it's supposed to, a background extra hitting his mark, reacting exactly as instructed. Except that's not what's actually happening. That's costume designer Marcy Rogers' actual father, R, seated in the front row of that recreated scene, and the reaction you see on screen isn't a performance at all. It's a real family member of the production watching a piece of history get physically rebuilt in FR want of him for the very first time. Rogers has talked about the moment openly. When her father showed up on set that day, in that seat, in that recreated crowd, she said he was cooler than she was. That's not a detail that changes the plot of the movie by a single beat. But it tells you something quietly important about how this entire production was built. Layer after layer of people with a genuine, personal, emotional stake in getting this exactly right, standing just off camera or sitting right there in frame, watching their own history come back to life around them. 20 staffers. That's how many people worked directly under Rogers, just on wardrobe for this single film. A small army dedicated entirely to sequins, buckles, socks, and glove stitching. And when you learn what their actual mission statement was, the whole visual language of this movie starts to click into place. They weren't trying to satisfy critics. They weren't trying to hit a studio note about how iconic a costume should photograph in a trailer. Rogers has said plainly that the real goal, the actual bar they were building toward, was for the Jackson family itself to look at these costumes and feel that accuracy in their bones. Not admire it, feel it. That's an unusual standard for a Hollywood production to hold itself to. Most films answer to an executive with notes on a Tuesday. This one was quietly answering to the people who actually lived every one of these outfits in real time, decades earlier. Once you know that, every glove, every belt buckle, every glittery sock stops looking like a costume choice and starts looking like a test the filmmaking team was determined not to fail. This one is easy to miss because it's built entirely around an absence, around what the camera refuses to show you. During the Thriller music video production sequence, there's a director present on set. He's clearly there, clearly directing, clearly part of the scene's energy. But if you're paying close attention to the blocking, he's only ever shown from a distance, or half swallowed in shadow at the edge of frame. The script never gives him a full name. He's referred to only as John, and only twice, both times in passing, like the film is trying to get the scene over with as quickly as possible. That's John Landis, the real-life director of the Thriller short film. And the reason his face stays deliberately just out of frame isn't a budget decision, and it isn't an actor scheduling issue either. It's almost certainly because giving him a full, proper introduction on screen would force the film to acknowledge something much darker sitting right next to this triumphant chapter of Michael's career. Landis was the director responsible for the horrific on-set accident during Twilight Zone the movie that killed 3 people, including 2 children, in a helicopter crash just 2 weeks before Michael hired him to direct Thriller. Naming him fully, showing his face clearly, would mean the film has to reckon with that timeline sitting right next to one of its most celebratory sequences. So instead, it keeps him in the shadows, literally. If you know your Michael Jackson history cold, the release dates, the chart runs, the year-by-year sequence of events, something is going to feel slightly off about the back half of this movie, and it's not a mistake. It's a decision, made carefully, by people who almost certainly knew exactly what they were changing. In real life, Thriller was released in late 1982, and Michael's legendary Motown 25 performance happened months later in the spring of 1983. After the album and its videos had already started reshaping pop culture around the world. The film reverses that order. It shows Michael still deep in production on Thriller well into 1983, and it places the Motown 25 performance before the Thriller video is even finished, rather than after, which is how it actually happened. For pure storytelling purposes, that flip makes total sense. It lets Motown 25 function as the film's big cinematic climax, the emotional mountaintop moment, rather than just another mid-story beat buried in the middle act. But it does quietly rewrite the actual sequence of one of the most exhaustively well-documented years in music history, and almost nobody watching in a theater would ever clock the swap. The film frames the Jacksons' victory tour almost entirely as Joe Jackson's power play, one last desperate attempt by their father to reassert control over sons who were already outgrowing him, already pulling away toward their own solo identities. Dramatically, it lands hard. Coleman Domingo's Joe practically radiates that hunger for control in every single scene leading up to the tour, and by the time it actually kicks off, it feels less like a celebration and more like a hostage situation dressed up in stadium lighting. But there's a detail the film conveniently glosses right past. The tour wasn't some spontaneous idea Joe cooked up out of pure desperation in a single dramatic scene. It was built around Victory, an actual Jackson studio album that had already been released the year before the tour even launched, meaning the commercial machinery, the label deals, the business logic was already in motion well before the story frames it as a last panicked stand by a controlling father. It's a small omission in the grand scheme of a 2-hour film, but it reveals something about how this movie builds its emotional arcs, sometimes by quietly simplifying the business reality underneath a scene, just enough to sharpen the family drama sitting on top of it. We're halfway through this list, and so far, everything we've covered has been a compliment, historical accuracy, family involvement, a costume department obsessed with getting it right, If the movie ended here, this would just be a highlight reel of impressive filmmaking choices. But stick around, because the second half of this list is where the tone starts to shift, where hidden detail stops meaning cool Easter egg and starts meaning something a lot closer to thing the film hoped you wouldn't think about too hard.